I'm going to start by asking you to close your eyes. So please, everybody, close your eyes. And just listen to your thoughts. Tune in to what's going through your mind. You can open your eyes again. So what you've caught yourself doing is you have caught yourself telling yourself your story. Because we live our lives as if a TV documentary maker is accompanying us everywhere and saying, what are you doing now? What are you thinking? What are you feeling about it? What do you think is going to happen next? And that is part of the way our brain works. So you have caught yourself now just writing a little paragraph which has gone into your story. So what is your story? Well, it's very hard to describe the complexity of one human being, but you came into this world with 4 huge drivers. You came in with an instinct to protect yourself and what you value. You came in with an instinct to bond with people, to bond in intimate relationships, to make coalitions to get things done. You came in with a strong drive to learn, and you came in with a strong drive to achieve. And those 4 drives were shaped and molded by every experience you have had, particularly the really early experiences you had with your own family. And out of those early experiences, you have constructed the city of your life. It is constructed of all of the roles you play in your life. Me as daughter, me as son, me as mother, me as father, me as friend, me as worker, me as citizen. And going with those roles, all of the goals and aspirations that you have built upon them. And that's a very, very busy city. And you would wonder how the human brain could possibly keep track and bring some unity and coherence into such a busy enterprise, such a complex, old, busy, evolving enterprise. And your brain does it through the medium of story. So wrapped around your life, wrapped around your psyche and all that it contains is your life narrative. And that life narrative is not rigid. That life narrative is like a living membrane. It's constantly reacting to all the things that are happening to you. And if your membrane is working well, it's filtering all the nutrients that you are getting from your life and blocking all the toxins. And if your story is not working for you, it's doing the opposite. It's starving you of your nutrients and it's letting those toxins come in. So your story really matters because your story is your identity. Your story is your purpose and gives you your purpose in life. And your story provides you with one of the deepest human needs, which is for meaning. That's how you make sense of the whole thing. And your story is built on fundamental assumptions. The architecture of your story is really built on 3 assumptions. Out of all those experiences you've had in your life, you have formed a basic assumption about the kind of person you are. And essentially, you are deciding, am I, on the basis of all that's happened to me, am I worthy of respect and love or not, or only in some circumstances? The second assumption is, what can I expect from other people? Can I trust them or not? And the third assumption is your assumption about the future. Is the future full of threat or full of possibility? And those assumptions become your frame. So life doesn't just happen us. Events don't just happen us. Events are seen through the frame of these three assumptions. And that is how we build in our reaction patterns. That is how we build in expectations of what's going to happen us. And of course, as you all know, human beings are incredibly malleable to expectations. If you have a positive expectation of life, you've already raised the likelihood significantly of that outcome actually being positive, and vice versa. So where does your story come from? Well, we have many selves and we have many stories. In fact, we have as many different selves as people in our lives whose opinion we care about. We mould a self around an important person whose opinion we care about. And each self is shaped by the expectation that that person has of us. So our mother has an expectation of us, and we mould ourselves as children around that expectation, and our father and our partner and our best friend and our boss. And these expectations are governed by a set of if-then rules, which we learn on the basis of our experience with that person. If I love, I will be loved back. If I work hard, I will be rewarded. If I love, I'll be let down. If I work hard, it'll make no difference. And these become internalized, very often unconsciously, as the iron rules that we use to govern ourselves. And these can be if-then rules that liberate us to possibility, or that bind us to a kind of internal tyranny. And bit by bit, the more we have an interaction with a particular person, the more that particular self gets molded around them, and the more unconsciously it gets activated. So that if your experience of authority has been negative, then every time you come against any authority figure, a particular self is activated in relation to that authority figure. And that's really how we perpetuate early experiences. And eventually, whatever self gets activated the most often becomes the dominant self. That becomes your typical self. And that is how you answer the question, who are you? This is me. Except we're so unconscious that that's just one of many selves that we can bring to bear. And that me may not coincide with you at your best. If I were to ask any member of this audience to tell me the 4 or 5 times that you remember straight off of being at your best in life, when you took whatever it is you had in the way of your personal resources, your intellect, your emotional competencies, your life experiences, and you just got them together to rise to a challenge and be the right person to do the right thing in that circumstance. That's us at our best, and we all have a connection to what we're like at our best. And yet, at any one time, only 20% of people describe themselves as at their best. I wish I could tell you that there's an instruction to be at your best all the time in life. I couldn't, because life is just too tough. But I do think we can do better than 20%. And what I can tell you, though, is that I can tell you what blocks us from flourishing. What blocks us from being at our best is when we lose a very particular ratio between positive and negative in our lives. We know, for example, now, from so many different areas of psychological science, that the very minimum we need to manage, just to be average, just to be ordinary, just not to get into trouble, is 3 positives for 1 negative. Not double, 3 times. That's just the minimum. But we also know that if you ramp up that ratio to 5 to 1, that is the trigger for being at your best. That's the trigger for flourishing, whether it's in your life, whether it's in your marriage, whether it's in your most important relationships. and even whether it's in your business or your organization. From so many different arenas of psychological science, the results are merging, converging into that metric, which really seems to be a fundamental rule about how human beings function. And if you fall below 3 to 1 and stay below for significant periods, these are the awful moments in your life that trigger the downward cycle that we're all so familiar with, when you cannot be who you can be, when relationships enter that dangerous phase, and when businesses and organizations start languishing. And what I mean by positive, negative is very practical. I mean that your brain is wired to pay attention to emotions above everything else, because emotions are there to keep you safe in the world and to alert you to opportunity. The negative emotions are there to keep you safe, to alert you to threat, and the positive, the basic positive emotions are there to alert you to opportunity. These are the basic emotions that are there in your brain, and I'm not even going to bother defining the negative ones because you're all too familiar with them. But we pass over the positive emotions too quickly. We know love and liking, that's the most familiar. Liking something, loving something you do. The emotion of joy, which is the feeling of delight that something has turned out better than you thought. Gratitude, hugely positive emotion. Being thankful for something someone has done for you, or being thankful that something has come your way. Contentment, no big deal, just the feeling that something is just right. Interest, the open-mindedness to the new. Hope, pride, humour. We don't think of humour as being something that is an emotion, but it is, and single-handedly has kept the Irish economy going since 2010. Inspiration, the feeling of uplift in your chest when you see any example of human excellence, whether it's small or big, and the feeling of awe, when you're stopped in your tracks and humbled by something that's so beautiful, so brave, so heroic. So what I mean by positive-negative ratios is this. It's very practical. It means that day to day, in your life, in your relationship, in your organization, you have to be experiencing 5 of the basic positive emotions for every one negative if you want to flourish and be at your best. Now, your story is not just a reflection of that ratio in your life, but it's also a powerful driver of that positivity-negativity ratio. So it's not just reflecting whether you're flourishing or languishing, it's actually connecting you to yourself at your best, and it's connecting you to yourself at your worst. So your story is a dynamic part of your psyche. And stories can keep us in a languishing cycle. For example, when your story of yourself is dominated by someone else's view of you that is so disconnected from the way you internally and privately feel about yourself. When your story excludes some really important experience you've had, but that you're too ashamed, you're too humiliated, you're too fearful, you're too driven to actually keep it in. So your story has a rigid feel because something so important is being excluded. Your story keeps you languishing when you lose the authorship of your life because you're too busy writing chapters in other people's lives. And your story can get disrupted and derailed by great adversity. But you might say, look, all right, okay, my story is important, but look, my problems are too real for this. Well, I want to tell you about something I think may change your mind about that. The Buddha, said our life is the creation of our mind. And there are volumes and libraries really good psychological research that actually go to prove that the Buddha was 100% correct. If you really, really, really believed that, if you really believed that your life is the creation of your mind, just imagine what you could do with your life. Just imagine the changes that you could make. Just imagine the sense of control you could get. And you can really believe it because it actually is true. And I want to tell you about a really fascinating body of psychology that is relatively recent. Psychologists spent a huge amount of time studying people, who fall over the cliff, who become depressed and despondent and anxious and can't function as a result of the great adversity that they faced in their lives. But psychologists have more recently begun to study people who suffered real adversity, people who had accidents and became paralyzed in adult life, people who got life-threatening illnesses, people who lost family members in the most traumatic circumstances, and they began to study them. And they found actually very, very few really are permanently impaired. Most survive, maybe not quite the same people they were, but they survive. Very significant minority recover. They get back a life of the same quality, even though it may be very different. But here's what's interesting. A minority flourish, and they flourish under fire. And they don't flourish in spite of what happened to them, they flourish because of what happened to them. And here's one of the ways they do it. It is the way that they tell the story to themselves. And these stories have been divided by some psychologists into what are called redemption stories and contamination stories. And redemption stories are people who really think out what's happened to them. They are in absolutely no denial. These are not Pollyanna people. These are people who are acutely and painfully aware of what they've lost in life. But somehow they get to see the crisis as the beginning of something new, not the end. And in all of their stories, while they acknowledge the negative, it always gives way to the positive. And they have fabulous outcomes. These are among the most inspirational people that you can listen to. And then there are those who have contamination narratives. They tell their story as if my life was once good, and now it's gone. It's spoiled, it's contaminated, it will never be the same again. And that leads to predictable outcomes: despondency, low functioning, depression, etc. And what those who flourish under fire, what they manage to do is they manage to find value in what's happened to them. Do they wish it didn't happen? Of course. Would they wish it in anyone else? No. But they manage to find value. They manage to find a value in terms of what they've learned about themselves, about other people, about the strengths they found in themselves, about the love and support they found in others, about the wisdom that they've garnered. And they think, well, I wouldn't be this person now. I wouldn't have this transformation except that happened to me. And that's how they find value. And so you can transform your narrative in the same way. And I hope nobody in this audience is suffering from the kind of adversity that I just described, but some of you may be. But you have the usual quota of setbacks, failures, finding yourself where you never wanted to be and never thought you would be, as many people in Ireland have in the last couple of years, and the usual quota of betrayals that we have in life. So start by writing, because we are incredibly careless about the story we're telling ourselves, only half tuning in every so often. I wrote my own story about 15 years ago, and I'm someone who thinks a lot about my own psychology, and I found that I had forgotten really significant things, including the fact that I loved my grandmother. I lived with my grandmother for a lot of my childhood, and she died when I was 16, right before my leaving cert. And I was so heartbroken, I never actually properly grieved for her at all. And when I wrote my story, I began to remember my grandmother. But of course, when you bury grief or any negative feeling, you also bury all the joy that you had in that period of your life and with that person. And I remembered myself as so free and so joyous at that stage of my life. And once I connected to that, I connected to the capacity in myself again. So even people who think a lot about themselves and who think a lot about their own psychology forget whole chapters of their story. And when you're writing your story, please be aware of where you decided to start. And why did you decide to start there? Why was that the beginning? Why did you include certain people and not others, which is what I discovered myself? How do you organize the chapters in your life? How do you decide when some episode begins and ends? Are you still finishing off episodes that really were finished a long time ago? Or really, have you left behind something that you never finished? And how do you now think, looking back on it, that earlier events actually shaped you? Are there recurring patterns? And how do you see your story ending? And these are fascinating things to discover about yourself. Really fascinating. And we know psychologically that writing is so good for your brain because you're harnessing the power of language and structure to put a pattern on something that is really just so disorganized in your head. We know, for example, that when people write for 3 days, 15 minutes per day, about something really negative and unpleasant and maybe traumatic that happened to them, that the actual act of writing reduces their physiological stress. It relieves the negative feelings that surround the event. It makes it easier for them to connect with other people and to get support from other people, and it actually makes them happier. 3 days, 15 minutes. You can do that about your own life. But you can also ask yourself the most interesting question. Does my story have to be like this? And of course, the answer is no, unless you want it to be. So I suggest you look for the gold, in the same way as those who get, flourish under fire. Make a point of remembering and describing the real high points in your life. Make a point of describing the low points and how you survived them, because you did. We have this fantasy that life is stable and that somehow, change is always a surprise when it comes. Your life, you will recall, as you begin to write it, is full of transitions. Some psychologists think we spend 50% of our time, of our life, in transition. We have gotten over all kinds of changes already, and here you are. You're still here. So describe how you actually got over your low points, because only you have access to that precious information. Nobody else can tell you how you did it. Only you know how you did it, and you did. Recall the moments of intense connection with people, and recall the moments when you set yourself free and you soared. Because we all have something that holds us back, some self-doubt or worry about risk or worry about being wrong or being disapproved of. And there are always moments when we can unhook ourselves from that. They're wonderful moments to remember. And describe how you now are and what appreciation of life you now have as a result of your experiences. And particularly the moments when you became conscious in your life of the importance of little things, the kind of joyful awareness of the physical beauty of the world, the preciousness of the moment, the absolute gift of love. Write about those, because not one person in this room has not had these experiences. And why would you cut yourself off from these sources of such powerful positive emotions that are not just there for memory, but are there available to you now to bring into your life? And create a platform for the future. jump to the last chapter. The chapter can be 5 years, 10 years from now, and write it in a really particular way. Start with the date you are writing. On the 16th of November 2012, I started my journey. And imagine that you're up here instead of me, and that this audience is full of people that you care about, and you want to tell them about your journey from the 16th of November 2012 to that day, and describe it in as much detail as you can. Describe where you want to be as if you're already there. And then a very interesting thing happens in your brain, because your brain immediately starts setting up all of the things you have to do now to get you there. So if what it does is that positioning yourself in the future creates a platform, and that platform seems to release in us our innate wisdom about what we need to do to be at our best in life. It'll come to you what you need to do. And the harvest, those new paths and possibility, with all the practicalities that go with them. Because imagine, as you were describing, I started the journey and then I did this. You will actually begin to define what it is you need to do. And you'll grow wise. And I hope that if there's one thing I'll have the day I die, it's wisdom. That my one and only life will have given me, I think, its greatest bounty, which is the most we can hope for in life, is that we are wise when we die. And what I mean by wisdom is a really deep understanding and a perspective on life, an awareness of how dependent we are one on the other, a deepening of compassion for the common lot of humanity. That's what I mean by wisdom. And paradoxically, of course, when we have that wisdom, which largely comes actually from the things that happen us that we didn't want to happen us, is that we are released from, I suppose, the loneliest place that there is for humanity, which is being locked inside your own skin. Because people who have that sense of our interdependence one on the other are connected by an invisible thread with all the people around them and with humanity in general. And the first transformative question I think you ask yourself, I borrowed from the great Auschwitz survivor Viktor Frankl, who said in the throes of his suffering that he learned not to ask what I should expect of life, but what life now is expecting of me. That is an extraordinarily transformational question to ask yourself. Given where I am now, what is life expecting of me? It turns you from a victim into an agent. And the second question, which is one I use all the time myself, is there anything about what's happened to me in life, good, bad, and indifferent, particularly the bad things, any setback or failures that you've had, is there anything now that this situation allows me to do that I otherwise wouldn't have done or couldn't have done? And the answer is always yes. Always yes. It may not give you the outcome that you think, but you'll never regret the outcome. So you can rewrite your life. You can reclaim the authorship of your story. You can create a different story of yourself that's better, that gives you your rightful place in the world and your capacity to make it a better place. And then you have to go and make it happen. Because the really most tragic words, I think, are could have, should have, didn't. So do.